episode of OwlChemist Discussions. It is with great pleasure to introduce to you Valerio Maggi. He is joining us from Bassano del Grappa, Italy. He has a background in sociology as well as a master's in analytical psychology. He has an incredibly deep knowledge of politics and philosophy, which I've admired since the day that I met him. So I'm really, really ecstatic to release this conversation. I think in the past, like politics, political figures, these people in power kind of had this like almost like star status. Like they were like, oh, these people who can't do any wrong, they're protecting us, they're good, they're almost like, elevated to this like non-human sense. And now with technology and information and journalism, that's kind of like given us actually the truth about the corruption and the corrosion and lobbyists and all this crap actually happening in politics. So is that kind of what political disillusionment is?
Yeah, these modern ways of having information, they all concur in the whole process of dissolution. Because, for example, the idea that now people have really quick access to information, in the same way, you acquire more information on what's happening in the modern politics. So you see also the shadow sides of corruption and pure degeneracy also sometimes. But at the same time, it tends to give everything about contemporary history a political tone. That is to say, which is completely opposite to what traditional metaphysics means as history, because you cannot just put historical events at the feet of human will. You have also this whole metaphysical realm that acts above. That's the actual definition. Above, as above, so below. So it goes the sayings of metaphysics. So you cannot actually put history into a complete and absolute system of information. So at the same time, you have people that are more informed, which is a really good thing, but it's not having the metaphysical, let's say, narratives nowadays. People tend to absolutize history into just the political processes happening, and therefore they will try in some way or the other of taking control or taking action into these historical events, which is something that we have seen happening all over the world nowadays with the pandemic and many other issues that are happening.
So would you say that like by people not taking into account like like the collective unconscious and like things that are happening like metaphysically, psychologically, for example, people are basically leaving out half of or a very important part of why these events happen?
Yeah, because by just seeing what's on the outside in a just purely material fashion, because it is mediated through internet, which is images that are purely material in metaphysical terms, and therefore they think that by changing activities on a political level, you would have a change of the system, because actually in a materialistic way you tend to see world politics and history as a concrete set. They would not try to quest themselves interiorly, which would give them a way of action, of behaving into the world, of understanding and knowledge that would just wouldn't the political level to absorb every aspect of your life. So in a sense, you tend hopefully to see things as proximity, basically. So you start acting with virtue in your community. If your community is a community that has difficulties, that is oppressed, you will tend to act into the community in a virtuous way. So I knew that then you have also the political level of action. But this age of overload of information can take people to just think that taking actions politically would just solve any problem, because they're not introspective enough, in a sense. even though some of them they seem to be introspective people.
I have heard people, like, especially lately, kind of like complaining about, like, in particular, like the Black Lives Matter movement in America, saying like, oh, like, well, real changes are going to come from, you know, people addressing like their implicit bias, and the real changes are going to come from, you know, these little things that we do in our own, you know, personal sphere of life. And then I've heard the flip side that was like, well, real changes aren't going to happen because what's actually changing politically, like what laws are changing, what's happening legislatively. And it's like, well, if you kind of really look at it, I think it's changing from all different sides. Like there's so much happening. So the question I had for you was like, do you think that in like really in is it's kind of like if you change something politically, will it change something fundamentally, or can it has to change fundamentally before it can even manifest into politics?
Yeah, I would say the last one, that things have to change fundamentally in order to have a political change.
Okay.
In many ways, you may have politics that try to act as a religion, actually, because if you try to take away metaphysics, which is unescapable existentially, you will tend to make a counterfeit of it, which is through ideologies.
Totally.
And this is something that always acts in a really Hegelian way, which is of having opposites. And through the act of these opposites, you can bring about political changes, no matter how this dialectic acts, because it is inherent that you have a synthesis in the future. But what happens in the process of synthesis is not really clear, actually.
So post-human, can you like go into that a little bit more? Because I guess what I don't quite understand about post-human is like, is that similar to like transcendentalism?
Posthumanism, just to give quick examples, would be the hybridation of man and machines. So it's really futuristic stuff.
So it's kind of more like post the abilities of humans. It's more technologically advanced. So kind of how I've been hearing people say things about having like robots for politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what? I'm like, where's this coming from? I mean, depends who's programming the robot, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but the whole idea is that human beings, as such, they're just imperfect,
Mm-hmm.
which is completely against traditional metaphysics, because the way you are is a given.
Mm-hmm.
So you cannot change it as much as you cannot change your past, who your parents are, where you're born, when. So these are all things that in the post-human outlook should matter no more, because these are the things that make possible to a human intellect to understand that there's a whole world of givens,
Right.
including personhood.
How does Jung like come into this?
Well, Jung is I think that he honestly, although also unconsciously, tried to build a metaphysical system.
Yeah.
Because beyond is just merely psychological and psychopathological studies, he tries to try to do what I was saying before, trying to get in touch with the supposedly transcendental realm through imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as I said before, this can be really insightful into your own being, to
Right.
see how you imagine things. And the idea of the collective unconscious would be also the idea that humans share a level of equality in their features. So that would be like, that's why humans have this kind of archetypes inbuilt into their psyche. But the point is that this can lead you, when you are really involved into the history of your time,
Mm-hmm.
you will tend to start to have things as prophecies. You will start to think that your kind of thinking has some prophetic powers, and therefore you can foresee the future. And in the same way that you foresee the future, you bring that up because you kind of will reality into being, into history. So you have the issue of Jung and his involvement and his comments on the Jews with Nazism,
Yeah.
because as Andrew Samuels said out to us during a lecture, there
Right.
are very little doubts that Jung was himself an anti-Semite, and this drove from his particular kind of thinking. And for example, in the US, the alt-right, they deploy Jung massively. The Richard Spencer, their leader, he thinks that through their activity of memeing, me, posting memes on the internet, they kind of summoned a Greek god called Kek, and this god of chaos put Donald Trump into office because, and this they really draw on the idea of synchronicity, for example,
Okay.
because they think that some events are brought about a collective attempt of people and their consciousness to will things into being. And that's really problematic because at times you will start to, they call Trump the god emperor. He's being sent by Christ himself to save the world from leftist satanism. And
Yeah.
the problem is that this happens as well on the left.
Had a friend who said to me, because when Trump like came into office, I was like, oh my God, like my stomach hurts, like what's gonna change, what's gonna happen? I'm honestly like afraid. And she was like, well, whatever happens, and we already can kind of see this, is he's going to be bringing darkness to light. And I
Hmm.
feel like that has really happened. And like there's just so much that, you know, a lot of Americans thought like, oh, that's not a problem anymore. People don't think that. That's not happening. And like with him being in office, you're like, oh no, here it is. It's like serving to you right on a platter in front of your face, and you can't even, if you choose to ignore it, you're just really choosing to be ignorant at this point. Um,
Mm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I could kind of see in a way people saying that he is like this god of chaos in a sense, but
Hmm.
see it in like a positive light is kind of like uh
Yeah, because that plays on the division on politics. Because on the one side you have this really progressive outlook that is really on equality, rights, and freedoms, whereas you have the so-called political right, which has this idea of nostalgia of the past,
mhm,
of a supposedly greatness in the past, which, I mean, probably there was some greatness in the past, but the idea that you can bring it about back from the past is just it is an act of magic, actually. If you think about it, it's a kind of evoking something from the past, and through the investigation of people's imagination that can be also archetypal,
right,
you can have a more democratic society, because the emotions and how people think that reality should be can be taken into account more efficiently, which is something that can happen through internet, for example, because from internet you can have people or their thinking
right,
more explicit into the scene, whereas before you had people just talking, chatting
right,
outside, and you couldn't be able to catch what they were thinking. Whereas now you have a perfect or quasi perfect view on people's political ideas, as well as their personality
mm,
in some sense. So, and I guess that Jung is really highly deployed in contemporary politics. Maybe also in some esoteric way, because world politics also works a lot with shadow politics or deep politics. I don't want to sound conspiratorial, because I believe that conspiracy theories are a way of um, a means of self-indulgence and
Yeah.
an absolution of evil. So therefore, evil is somewhere there acting on its own, which is something I don't believe in.
It's interesting they brought up conspiracy theories because I think like when I was younger, I got like pretty heavy into conspiracy theories. So I was like, whoa. And of course, like there were some conspiracy theories in the past that did come to be true. And I think even with like recent events, I've been seeing people going in on about conspiracy theories. And I'm kind of like, well, my friend sent me this quote, which was amazing, which said that part of the reason why people feel the need to come up with so much conspiracy is because they can't accept that the reality of the world is that it is chaos. And there are things that happen that just don't make sense. And to constantly look for how there's like these evil aliens infiltrating the minds of our politicians, manipulating everything that's happening is like, maybe a little far out, because if you can really look at history, if you can really look at the state of the people, even, and like how we're talking about, even like psychologically and spiritually, it's tends to at some point make sense.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Because if you think about it, these kind of evil beings acting upon us,
Mm.
they can be seen also as a sign of neurosis. Evil, in my opinion, shouldn't be seen as an absolute, but as a deviation from goodness, which is the principle of being as such.
Mm.
And thinking of evil beings that can be politician, the antichrist, aliens, or whatever, it's a way of externalizing these kind of internal demons that
Mhm.
act through people, because evil is a human concept, is about human existence, is not a concept inherent of being itself. Thinking that evil is just outside of on the political scene, for example, as far as history is concerned, is a complete act of self-indulgence, of not taking into account how much evil and how much you can on your own deviate from goodness, and
Mhm.
how much every one of us is responsible for the current situation in one way or the other.
I read this quote once that said like, like the past and the future are similar to images in a dream. It's not really there. Um, do you think that in some ways, people who are like hanging on to the past and thinking that let's bring, like we said earlier, for example, like, bringing this greatness of America from the past into the now, which like the greatness of America, like when was it even? Have any thoughts on like where that comes from? Like this hopeful potentiality or this attachment to something somebody thinks is great. Do you have thoughts on like what that could be rooted in?
Probably in some kind of wishful thinking, because if someone is somewhat really futuristic or progressive in a really nuanced sense, he will tend to project his imagination into the future as something desirable to achieve. Whereas a person who, by its own personality, tend to be more conservative, he will tend to have this same kind of imagination, but projecting into the past, which has some ground, obviously, because there's some greatness in the past, because great things have been done in the past, as well as really low and vulgar things. So the past, as well as everything you are given with, body, family, place, and time, are all things that are a blessing and a curse. So if you are born, for example, I was born in Italy, you can be really proud of your country, but you shouldn't be someone who says that there has been an absolute greatness in the past that should be brought back, because the past has its mode of being as being literally the past, something that has passed, which remains in some form, sometimes as nostalgia, but something that is not just good as such, because it was about human experience, so it's faulted as everything that's about humans.
How can the average person kind of apply post-humanism to their like politics, and how do you think it could help?
Well, as a self-awareness of the political ecosystem, maybe that's a good word, or the political events are unfolding. But on a deeper level, if someone is to think about taking actions, I would say that being aware of how much it goes deep into human existence and into the realm of metaphysics in some sense should make people really aware about how to nurture their lives, because you will otherwise tend to fall into absolute nihilism, because you would just view yourself as a political agent, whereas you would think about not participating just by saying no without, you don't necessarily need to take action. I mean, you can take action after that, after you said no, when things just come at your way and your freedom is actually infringed upon. But there can be the tendency to just act out of maybe some heroism, which is necessary in life, but sometimes you will just fight against the trees at times, where then this really works on the side of those holding power, because they would really like to have people beating each other's head instead of really pointing towards who's politically responsible for policies and laws. And these people are, in fact, never really targeted against, because they really work on this whole situation of chaos on world politics, because from there they can come up as with new ideas that are implemented nowadays. And therefore, if people would be able to nurture their lives with some virtues, that means loving oneself, loving those who are around you, and really act. I mean, if you love someone, you would also point something that's going wrong, but love being the end in life should take you into being someone who's nurturing yourself as well as your community.
Example of like when you think it is better to not take action.
People in Italy have gone really, really mad, because at one point there was the idea of transgender classes for primary school children. Okay. And they had all their protests, and they said we're not allowing these kind of things to be taught to our children, and this and that. Now, you may be right on not wanting your children to be taught this kind of thinking, but starting to manifest in front of the school, that doesn't get you anywhere, because you're protesting, but you would just need to don't bring your kid to school in that day. But protesting just will give you present you as someone who identifies, because he's a synthetic identity, as someone who is against this transsexual people, and as a reflection you would think of yourself as someone who's against transsexual people, because you will start to self-identify each other, and through that kind of mirroring you will acquire some kind of identity. And I think that's that's dangerous actually, because
Yeah.
they would make factions, they would make groups of identities that are not able to act organically and talk to each other. So sometimes just saying no will be enough. I mean, not even there are the gay prides, and now people are starting to get a bit annoyed by the idea of gay prides for whatever reason. Well, the whole what you can do is not watching it, not attending it,
Right.
turn off the internet, and go in a hill with your friends, have a tea, smoke a cigarette, and enjoying your life, loving. I mean,
Yeah.
something that I really like about traditional metaphysics is that if something good, it's self-sufficient. If you're doing something good, it's not because there's something bad that makes you act in that way. If you do something good, it's because it comes out of your inner goodness.
Do you think there's kind of like a line between like non-activism, activism, and then like kind of like bypassing, and maybe in ways, spiritual bypassing, um in a sense where, I know some people, and I'm guilty of this. When I was younger, I also kind of had this ideology of like, oh, everybody is made of love, and like, don't be angry, it's all through peace, and like, like I kind of had that mindset for a minute. um and then as I got older, I was like, wait a second, I don't really know if that's the right view to have, because I think it's important to, name, social phenomena. And I think there are times where it's, a good time to protest, to take action, and other times to not take action. um would you say, like, how would you kind of describe like that line of like, when it is bypassing?
Well, for example, if a protest is about the quest for justice,
Mhm.
for example, to take just an example that everybody would know, the assassination of George Floyd, it has obviously caused an insurgent of chaos, as it was presumable. What would you do in such cases? It's completely normal that people would start to riot, for example, and that would speak about a deeper wound, I would say, or suffering.
I agree.
And for example, if I had to think of any kind of action, you would see that you have black communities in the United States that really suffer from their oppression, and I see these communities as a communities that need healings. Whereas then you will start to project your own suffering, and then you will start to wound what's external to yourself, and then you wouldn't be able to heal your suffering. So, for example, being able to consider life as something which has much more than politics would have led probably to a response that were more on being conscious of the present suffering and a quest for justice without the attempt of making it about a system, because the only problem about talking about systemic racism is that you turn racism into something that is material and about a system, whereas racism, as I tried to say before, is the complete devaluation of one's worth, and therefore of anybody else's worth. Because a racist just he would hate anyone if he had to, not just a person of different color. So, and this is eating in this moment a strong resurgence of nationalism and white supremacy, which is really worrying, because I don't think that the left can can keep it up for what's coming next in terms of political rights and their narratives. So,
Yeah.
uh, um, I mean, people are really suffering from the politics of this solution because you're feeling that your soul is turning apart, and therefore we have a humanity that is in search of healing, actually,
Right.
and justice, which is something that is always necessary in human societies.
Right.
But when you take the suffering and you use the quest of justice as an unconscious excuse, you're gonna have a lot of troubles because you have suffering people, wounded people that would just act really aggressively, which is something that happens, and you're gonna get a response eventually from this so-called this other side, which is a complete made up other side that gets identified with their own other side. So that would get us in big trouble, I would say. So for activism in general, I think that it goes beyond its best intentions when revolutionary thinking comes into play, because the revolution really tends to believe as world politics and history as a complete system that can be revolutionized through a previous destruction. And that's, I don't think, would bring healing to anyone, because if you think about it, even from a Jungian psychotherapeutical perspective, if something makes you suffer, you have to deal with it without rejecting it, and by becoming conscious of it, you wouldn't just project it into the external world and act aggressively towards your own suffering. So I think that there's a lot of, in some sense, maybe activism is a kind of a therapy of politics, in a sense, which requires high levels of self-consciousness and awareness of their own suffering, basically.
Wow. So I said in a previous video that, like, we keep saying, I have said it as well, like, systemic racism people kind of see as this archetypal blob of like negative energy per se, but really, like, the systemic racism is something that's so embedded in people's minds on a lot of times a very unconscious level. And like those examples can be, discrimination, hiring discrimination. It's like, implicit bias. It's, cultural appropriation, like, these things. Um, would you say then that, like, systemic racism as something metaphysical psychologically is a symptom of this deeper suffering that is from such a long history of pain inflicted on the Black community? And would you say that now, with this, all coming up, this social movement, the conversations on social media, the protests, is a way of addressing that suffering? Or how would you see, a way for people to address this suffering in a way that you think would bring lasting change?
Well, yeah, it has a metaphysical ground, obviously, a really complex also situation, because on one side you have Black communities that are speaking up for what they think that had been suffering during their history in the North America. And you have also white people that, in a sense, claim to be aware of this same history and the suffering that their ancestors have caused. But on the other side, you have this kind of political debate that goes on in a really impulsive way. By that I mean pulses, as
Kind of like
you know, policies in a technological way. So you have all this action on the internet, which is, I would say, quite impressive.
Yeah.
Which is then obviously, and that's the reason why it's taken up by big corporation who obviously they never cared about black people, of course, because they hadn't to care about them, who are then now starting to hashtag Black Lives Matters, hashtag BLM.
Mhm.
And there you see how a really serious issue, which is how African Americans live their lives and how the history of their community is a burden on themselves, because as we try to say through this whole conversation, your past is something that you have as a burden, as a blessing and as a curse, because I would say that the black community in America have also their space for to strive into, because they started from complete oppression to becoming a very important integral part of American society, still having their past as a burden. So, but what I see as more troubling is people who are trying to erase their own past for the benefit of someone else's. So I mean, I'm not really agree with taking down the statue. I mean, apart from being completely useless for the political changes that people are asking, it is that kind of attempt of cutting oneself off his own past. If you think that a big part of the past of your society where you are born is about racism, the fact is that you take that as a burden, but with, as I said before, acts and thinking of forgiveness. Not because you have to forgive slave owners, but because you have to forgive in order to act through love. Because otherwise, you start to hate yourself, and that's what's happening many of the times. Because if you cannot forgive something of the past, it will haunt you, and therefore you hypertrophy this kind of hatred against yourself, which is something that happens, and which is something really dangerous, because I think that this would incite, it can incite terrorism, because white nationalists are not gonna keep up with this, I think.
Yeah, I'm kind of scared.
And from the other side, they're gonna keep pushing for this kind of stuff. So
I have been like in agreement with the statues coming down, and I think that like,
mhm,
part of that is mostly not because I think we should erase the past, but because I don't think that we should glorify these people for what they did to people.
mhm,
So like kind of what I thought about was Germany. I think they're pretty honest about what they've done, and like from all my German friends, like I know that they learn extensively about the horrific events that they inflicted onto people through the world wars. And I feel like in America, like our education, our education system, specifically in history, we brushed over all of the things that like we did wrong, and we made what we did wrong seem like we were helping so many people by doing it.
mhm,
So there was just so much like brainwashing, specifically around how Americans treated the Native Americans, or the Europeans, really, how they treated the Native
mhm,
Americans and the Black community. And so I feel like these statues are kind of symbolic again of that brainwashing. And I think why
mhm,
there has been like this, push and movement to get them down is in a way for us to get our real history, like tell us what you actually did, and not glorify what you did as like we're the best and we got this land and blah blah blah. And I wonder if right now, kind of how I said, like Germany I think they face what they did wrong and they admit that. And I think America hasn't done that. We admitted that, we aren't the best. We're very, very flawed. And like you said, just like humans. But I also agree with you in that, like, especially in terms of psychotherapy, like if you try to deny something and you try to eradicate it, it doesn't work like that, because you can't get rid of energy. You can only transform it. And so I kind of like see like even, what's happening as like a way of transforming how we've seen the culture, how we've, treated other races, and how we've seen our history.
Yeah, I agree on that. I mean, most of the times, I mean, for example, you cited Germany. Their awareness of what they've done during the Nazi period is been really is made really conscious to the German population, but at the same times, it made some kind of detachment from that past, because it's 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 kind of you are so conscious of your own past that you can break off from it, because okay, it's just the past. And now we have because also of that, on other issues, specifically on European unification, now you have the German right, who's having a huge resurgence, because what they are conscious of the racism against the Jews, the Holocaust, the totalitarianism, the violence, and all of that. But then they kind of not self-conscious of the economical practices that they had during that time. Right. And therefore, these kind of practices are the building blocks of the German economy, because they're still doing the same kind of mercantilistic exportation-led kind of economy, which is impoverishing the rest of Europe. So, and that's why many people try to equate the way that Germany is behaving at the moment with how they behaved during the war. So it's really good to become aware of your past, but not with the end goal of trying to cut it off from yourself, because it's something that you cannot.
Right. So
because the Germans did what they've done, and they will have to live it, not in the sense of guilt, but with, as I said before, forgiveness and love.
Hey guys, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you liked this, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I really hope that these videos have been giving people some perspective on things, hearing it from people who are educated and trained in these particular areas. Part of why I do this is because I felt like a lot of information that I've been taught in schools were, quite off limits to other people, and I think part of the amazing thing about the internet is being able to spread useful information, and so I hope that these videos have kind of been an agent in that change and part of our evolution and technology. So until next time, thank you so much for watching.